Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. I had always taken pride in my neighborhood. It was one of those rare places where people knew each other's names, stopped to chat during evening walks, and looked out for one another. The mornings were alive with the sound of sprinklers, children playing, and neighbors exchanging greetings. Evenings brought porch lights glowing warmly, and the occasional aroma of barbecues drifted through the air. It was, for lack of a better word, idyllic. That's why it felt so strange when the house across the street started to change. It had always been a lively place. Mrs. Carter's garden was always blooming, and Mr. Carter's old station wagon had a way of sputtering loudly down the street every morning like clockwork. Their house had been a constant in a neighborhood full of constants, until it wasn't. At first, I didn't think much of it. People go on vacations or get caught up in other things. But as days turned into weeks, something about the house began to gnaw at me. The curtains stayed drawn all the time. Mail piled up in their mailbox, spilling out onto the porch in a messy heap. The station wagon hadn't moved an inch. Yet, what struck me most was the subtle but persistent signs of life. At odd hours, I would catch glimpses of lights flickering on and off through the cracks in the curtains. Once I thought I heard the faint hum of a television. It was as if the house itself was trying to say, "Someone's still here. Don't look too closely." As the days dragged on, my casual curiosity turned into something heavier. A knot that sat at the pit of my stomach every time I glanced at the Carter's house. I began to notice patterns, or maybe I imagined them. The lights seemed to flash only late at night, always for the briefest of moments. The car, despite its usual inactivity, sometimes had its driver's side door left slightly ajar, as if someone had climbed in and out in a hurry. I found myself peering out of my window more than I cared to admit. The house seemed darker now, as though the air around it had grown thicker. I told myself it was ridiculous. People move, people travel. Maybe they'd simply forgotten to tell anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The mail was what finally pushed me over the edge. One morning, as I left for work, I noticed a pile of envelopes had spilled onto their porch. I hesitated, debating whether to pick it up. But something about stepping onto their property felt forbidden. I turned away and hurried to my car, but not without glancing back. The door, it was slightly open. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept drifting back to the house, its quiet, looming presence, a constant shadow in my thoughts. Around midnight, I found myself standing at the window again, staring out at the darkened street. That's when I saw it. A figure slipped into the Carter's backyard, moving with a purposeful, almost predatory grace. My breath caught, and I ducked instinctively, peering out from the edge of the curtain. They were dressed in dark clothing, their silhouette blending almost seamlessly with the night. I watched, frozen, as they disappeared around the side of the house. My heart pounded. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me, urging me to act, but I wasn't sure what to do. Call the police? Confront them? I stood there, paralyzed, as the seconds ticked by. Then I saw the faintest glimmer of light from the back of the house. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and slipped on my shoes. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them coherent. The stillness outside was suffocating as I crossed the street, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the back door, I found it ajar. The faint creak of the hinges sent a shiver down my spine. I hesitated, staring into the dimly lit interior of the house, and then I stepped inside. The house smelled of mildew and something else I couldn't place, a sharp, acrid scent that stung my nose. The hallway was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of a light bulb somewhere deeper inside. Shadows danced along the walls, stretching and shifting as I moved cautiously through the house. It was as though time had stopped here. The furniture sat undisturbed, layers of dust coating the surfaces. In the living room, a half-empty cup of coffee sat on the table, the liquid inside long evaporated, but the stain on the rim still fresh enough to suggest someone had been here recently. I heard a faint rustling sound and froze. It was coming from one of the bedrooms down the hall. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I crept closer. each step agonizingly slow. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the faint glow of a bulb casting long shadows across the walls. Peeking inside, I spotted the figure. They were hunched over a cupboard, rifling through drawers and shelves with frantic urgency. Papers and objects were scattered on the floor around them, but they didn't seem to care. My breath caught in my throat. The figure moved with a jerky, almost unnatural rhythm, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. I should have left. I should have turned and walked away right then. But I didn't. The figure turned. Their eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I knew I had made a terrible mistake. The figure's gaze pierced through the dim light, and in that instant I felt a cold realization. I shouldn't be there. He stood still for only a moment, but it was long enough for me to notice his disheveled appearance. Crumpled and torn clothes, a thin, hollow face, eyes that seemed to reflect nothing but shadows. Then he moved. He advanced towards me without hesitation, with erratic movements, but fast, too fast. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, and I stumbled backwards down the corridor. My flashlight fell out of my hands and rolled to the floor, its beam throwing wild, chaotic arcs across the walls as I stood up. The figure didn't stop. It came running down the corridor behind me, with heavy, implacable steps. I turned and ran, the house a confusing maze of dark corners and unfamiliar layouts. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out the sound of my own frantic breathing. I reached the living room and slammed into a table, knocking over the long-abandoned coffee cup. The crash seemed deafening in the stillness, but I didn't stop to look back. My focus was on the door, the front door, barely visible in the faint light from the street lamps outside. As I reached for the doorknob, something caught the back of my shirt, yanking me off balance. I fell hard, the impact jarring my shoulder, but adrenaline kept me moving. I kicked out blindly, connecting with something solid, and felt the grip on my shirt release. I didn't wait to see what had happened. I lunged for the door again, wrenched it open, and stumbled out into the cool night air. Behind me, the house was silent once more. No footsteps, no frantic movements, nothing but the faint creak of the door swinging in the breeze. Back in the safety of my own home, I locked every door and window, my hands trembling so badly I could barely manage the deadbolts. The street outside was as quiet as ever, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound to break the stillness. I stood by the window, peering out at the Carter's house. It loomed in the darkness, its presence heavy and oppressive. I expected to see the figure emerge, to hear sirens in the distance or shouting from other neighbors, but there was nothing. The hours dragged on. I sat on the couch, too afraid to turn off the lights, listening intently for any sound that might hint at what was happening next door. My thoughts were a chaotic mess. What had I just witnessed? Who was that? Why were they there? None of it made sense, and the more I tried to piece it together, the more my mind spiraled into unsettling possibilities. At some point, exhaustion caught up with me, though I couldn't remember falling asleep. I woke up with a start at dawn, the light filtering through the blinds. My heart raced as I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the figure staring back at me. But the street was empty, the house quiet and still. Despite every instinct telling me to leave it alone, I couldn't stay away from the Carter's house. As the sun rose higher, I found myself standing on their front porch, my stomach tight with anxiety. The door was locked. The mail, which had been scattered across the porch, was gone. Even the coffee cup I had knocked over was back on the table, upright and untouched. It was as if nothing had happened. I tried the doorbell, though I knew it was pointless. The hollow chime echoed faintly inside, unanswered. I circled the house, peering through the cracks in the curtains. Everything appeared as it always had, perfectly normal. Yet the memory of the previous night clung to me like a shadow. I couldn't shake the image of the figure, their frantic movements, their hollow eyes. It didn't feel real, but the ache in my shoulder from the fall and the scuff marks on my shoes told me otherwise. Neighbors passed by, waving cheerfully, but I couldn't bring myself to return their smiles. I wanted to tell someone, to ask if they had heard or seen anything, but I didn't know how to explain what had happened without sounding insane. So I stayed silent. I always found something calming about grocery shopping. There was a certain rhythm to walking through the aisles, picking up familiar items and checking them off my list. The store was brightly lit and bustling with activity, the hum of carts and conversations filling the air. It was just another ordinary errand, or so I thought. I'd only made it to the produce section when I noticed him for the first time, a man, maybe in his 40s, with a nondescript appearance. He was leaning casually against a display of oranges, his eyes fixed on something or someone. At the time, I didn't think much of it. People zone out all the time in grocery stores, right? But as I moved from aisle to aisle, his presence started to feel deliberate. No matter where I went, he seemed to be there. At first it was subtle, just a figure in the corner of my vision. Then it became more obvious. I turned down the cereal aisle, and there he was, pretending to study a box of granola bars. I moved to the dairy section, and he followed, idly examining a carton of milk. My heart began to race, but I tried to shake off the feeling. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. The store wasn't that big, and people often crisscross paths. Still, a knot of unease settled in my stomach as I grabbed the last item on my list and made my way to the checkout. The line at the checkout was mercifully short, but even there, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw him again, lingering near the magazine rack by the exit. He wasn't even pretending to shop anymore. I paid for my groceries, trying to act natural as I bagged them up. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up my bags and walked toward the exit, hoping he wouldn't follow. But when I stepped outside, the cool air hitting my face, I spotted him again. He was standing near the entrance, his eyes scanning the crowd. When they landed on me, he started walking. I quickened my pace, my mind racing. Maybe he wasn't following me. Maybe he was just heading in the same direction. But as I glanced back over my shoulder, he was still there, keeping a steady distance. I crossed the street, weaving through a small group of pedestrians in the hopes of losing him. When I turned the corner, I stopped briefly, pressing myself against a wall to catch my breath and calm my nerves. But no sooner had I turned around than I saw him again, stepping out from the corner I had just left. There was no mistaking it now. He was following me. My pulse quickened as I hurried down the street, clutching my grocery bags tightly. Every step I took, I could hear his not far behind, steady and deliberate. I ducked into a side street, hoping to lose him in the maze of narrow alleys that crisscrossed the neighborhood. But he followed, unrelenting. Panic started to set in. I racked my brain for an explanation. Why was he following me? I didn't recognize him, and I couldn't think of any reason I would have caught his attention. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I glanced back again, and he was still there, his pace matching mine. His expression was unreadable, and the way he moved, calm, purposeful, sent chills down my spine. He wasn't in a hurry, but he wasn't losing sight of me either. The sinking realization hit me. He wasn't going to stop. Whatever he wanted, he was determined to get it. The fear that had been building in my chest finally spilled over, and I broke into a run. My grocery bag swung wildly at my sides as I darted down one alley and into another, the sound of my shoes pounding against the pavement. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps quickening to match my pace. He wasn't running outright, but his steady stride kept him close enough to make my heart race faster. I turned sharply, nearly colliding with a lamppost, and found myself on a quieter street lined with houses. My eyes scanned the area frantically for somewhere, anywhere to hide. That's when I saw the wall. It was about 6 feet tall, separating a small front yard from the street. Beyond it, I could make out a balcony attached to the house. Without thinking, I dropped my bags, grabbed the edge of the wall, and hoisted myself up. My arms burned with the effort, but adrenaline carried me over. I landed clumsily in the yard, scrambling to my feet and rushing toward the balcony. Grabbing the railing, I pulled myself up and crouched low, pressing my back against the house. My chest heaved as I tried to quiet my breathing, straining my ears for any sign of the stalker. Seconds later, I heard his footsteps. From my crouched position on the balcony, I held my breath, my body trembling with adrenaline. The yard below was eerily quiet, but I could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching against the gravel in the alley I had just fled. My back pressed hard against the wall of the house, and I willed myself to stay still. to make no noise that might give me away. Peering through the gaps in the balcony's railing, I saw him step into view. He stopped in the middle of the yard, his head turning slightly as he surveyed the area. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might give me away. He moved with unsettling calm, his eyes scanning every corner of the yard. He didn't call out or make any noise. He just stood there, his presence oppressive and unnatural. For a moment I thought he might have noticed the balcony. I froze, biting down on the inside of my cheek to stop myself from making a sound. He took a few steps closer, his face now partially illuminated by the faint light spilling from a nearby street lamp. I caught a glimpse of his expression, calm, focused, and devoid of emotion. It wasn't the face of someone who had just stumbled upon me by accident. He was looking for me. Minutes felt like hours as he lingered, his eyes methodically combing through the yard. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back the way he had come. I waited until his footsteps faded completely before daring to exhale. I stayed on the balcony longer than I needed to, the fear of being spotted keeping me rooted in place. My muscles ached from the awkward position, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My mind replayed the moment he had stood so close, scanning for me, and I shuddered at how easily he could have spotted me if he had looked up. Finally, when I was certain the coast was clear, I crept toward the edge of the balcony and climbed back down into the yard. My hands were slick with sweat, making the descent clumsy and nerve-wracking. I landed softly on the grass, pausing again to listen for any sounds. Nothing. The street outside was quiet when I peered over the wall. I half expected to see him standing there, waiting, but it was empty. My breath came out in short, shaky bursts as I hoisted myself over the wall and back onto the street. I didn't go back for my groceries. The thought of lingering anywhere near the scene of the chase was unbearable. Instead, I stuck to the shadows, taking a roundabout route home to ensure I wasn't being followed. Every sound, a distant car engine, a rustling tree branch, made my pulse race, and every passing figure seemed like it could be him. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door and double-checked every window. The safety of my home felt fragile, like a thin barrier between me and the fear that still clung to me. The next morning, I tried to go about my day as if nothing had happened, but the memory of the man followed me like a shadow. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't eat, couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled deep in my chest. Every time I left the house, I found myself scanning the streets, searching for his face in the crowd. The paranoia was suffocating. A man standing at a bus stop would make my heart race. A stranger passing by too slowly on the sidewalk would send me into a spiral of fear. At night, the silence in my apartment felt oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows made me jump. I began double locking my door, checking the peephole whenever I heard footsteps in the hall. I knew it was irrational. He had taken nothing from me, done nothing to me, but the encounter had left a permanent mark. I couldn't stop wondering, why had he followed me? What had he wanted? The absence of answers made it worse, leaving my imagination to fill in the blanks with things I couldn't even put into words. Cleaning wasn't something I enjoyed, but after years of accumulating clutter, I decided it was time to go through every corner of the house. I started with the spare room, a space I rarely used except for storing boxes of forgotten belongings. That's where I found it, a loose floorboard beneath an old rug. It shifted unnaturally under my weight, and curiosity got the better of me. When I pried the board up, I found a small, dust-covered diary nestled in the hollow space beneath. The cover was faded, the leather brittle, and the pages yellowed with age. It had no name or markings to identify the owner. I hesitated before opening it, feeling a faint sense of intrusion, but the allure of a hidden diary was hard to resist. The first few pages were mundane, entries about daily life, struggles with work, and descriptions of the neighborhood. But as I flipped further, the tone began to change. The writer, whoever they were, wrote about hearing strange noises at night and feeling watched. Then I reached the final few entries. The handwriting was frantic, almost illegible. One passage stood out. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it's too late now. The evidence is hidden where no one will think to look. If anyone finds this, I hope they can forgive me or understand. I stared at the words, my mind racing. Evidence? What kind of evidence? The cryptic nature of the entry left too much to the imagination. My rational side told me this was likely fiction, an attempt by the writer to dramatize their life. But another part of me couldn't shake the unease the words stirred. I set the diary aside and continued cleaning, though the rest of the day passed in a fog. The idea of hidden evidence and an unknown crime lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. By evening, the diary had taken a permanent spot on the coffee table. I told myself I wouldn't think about it anymore, but I found my eyes drifting toward it again and again. After dinner, I couldn't resist and picked it up for another read. The more I analyzed the entries, the less sense they made. Some sections described ordinary frustrations, late rent payments, arguments with neighbors, but others seemed disconnected, as if the writer's mental state had been unraveling. It was fascinating in a way, but also unnerving. That night I felt unsettled as I prepared for bed. I told myself it was just the eerie nature of the diary playing tricks on me. The house had always been quiet at night, but as I lay there in the dark, I became acutely aware of every creak and groan. At one point, I thought I heard a faint noise, like footsteps outside the window. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. I shook it off, convincing myself it was an animal or the wind. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was restless. The next morning, I stepped out to grab the mail and froze. Scratches lined the lock on the front door, small but fresh. My stomach turned as I crouched to inspect them more closely. The marks didn't look accidental. They were deliberate, as if someone had been trying to force their way in. I glanced around the yard but saw nothing out of place. The neighbors' houses were quiet, and the street was empty except for a distant dog walker. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. I went back inside and checked all the doors and windows. They were all secure, but the scratches on the front door nagged at me. I couldn't think of a logical explanation. Later, as I tidied up the living room, I noticed something else. Faint, muddy footprints near the entryway. They weren't mine. I hadn't been outside since yesterday afternoon. Panic bubbled up, but I quickly tamped it down. Maybe I hadn't noticed them before. Maybe it was nothing. I moved the diary from the coffee table to my bedside drawer, thinking it would ease my nerves. But as the day wore on, I found myself checking the locks compulsively, unable to focus on anything else. That night, I lay in bed, straining to hear every sound. For a while, the house was still, and I began to think I had overreacted. But then I heard it again, the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. My heart pounded as I sat up, holding my breath. The sound came closer, stopping just outside the window. I didn't dare move, listening intently for any sign of a person. After what felt like an eternity, the sound faded away. The following nights were no better. Each evening brought more strange noises, soft tapping at the windows, a rattle at the front door, and occasional creaks on the porch. I reinforced the locks with makeshift barricades, using furniture and heavy objects to block the doors. Despite my efforts, the noises continued. Every creak, tap, or shuffle sent a jolt of fear through me. I began sleeping with a flashlight and a heavy wrench nearby, though I doubted they would do much good. Exhaustion began to take its toll, but no matter how tired I was, the fear kept me wide awake. I was nearing my limit. For days, the house had been alive with strange noises, creaks, thuds, and the persistent crunch of gravel outside. Each night I slept less, my nerves stretched thin by the constant fear. But the worst came one night when I woke to a sound I couldn't ignore, footsteps inside the house. I froze in place, gripping the wrench I had taken to keeping by my bedside. The sound was deliberate, slow, steady, and moving through the hallway. My mind raced, trying to determine if I had locked all the doors, though deep down, I knew I had. Summoning the courage, I crept out of bed and into the hallway. It was empty. The air was still, heavy with the kind of silence that seemed to press against my ears. But when I reached the back door, my heart sank. It was ajar, swinging slightly in the draft. I locked it immediately, pushing furniture against it for good measure. Something or someone had been inside. I couldn't ignore the possibility anymore. My thoughts turned to the diary and the cryptic mention of hidden evidence. By morning, I made a decision. If there was something in this house worth breaking in for, I needed to find it first. Armed with a flashlight, I began searching. I tore through the attic, sifted through forgotten boxes and closets, and even pried up loose floorboards, but I found nothing. If there was something hidden here, it eluded me, and now I was left with a house that felt more like a trap than a home. The search yielded nothing but a deeper sense of helplessness. I tried to go about my day, but every little sound set me on edge. Even in the daylight, the house felt suffocating. The constant vigilance was exhausting, yet the fear of letting my guard down was worse. The diary sat on my kitchen counter, a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong since I found it. Part of me wanted to burn it, to destroy it, and hope the strange events stopped. But another part, the one gripped by paranoia, feared that doing so might make things worse. The sounds grew bolder in the following nights. Heavy footsteps circled the house, and on one occasion I woke to find a window slightly cracked open, though I hadn't touched it. It was as if someone wanted me to know they could get in whenever they wanted. Sleep was no longer an option. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, jumping at every noise. By the fifth night, I couldn't take it anymore. My nerves were frayed, my body trembling from lack of rest. I realized there was no way I could stay here any longer. Desperation drove me to act. I called a friend and explained, vaguely, that I needed to leave immediately. They didn't ask questions, only offered to lend me enough money to cover a deposit on a new place. The relief was immediate. With the money secured, I packed hastily, throwing my belongings into boxes and bags without much thought. The diary, however, stayed behind. I placed it back in the hollow beneath the floorboard where I had found it, sealing it away with a finality that felt both liberating and terrifying. On the day of the move, I didn't look back. The moving truck felt like a lifeline, taking me away from the oppressive weight of that house. My new apartment was small, plain, and unremarkable, a perfect haven compared to what I had endured. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, the absence of fear as comforting as a warm blanket. I woke to the sound of something moving. At first, I thought it was the wind. Sharp gusts could sometimes make the wooden beams of the cabin creak. But this was different. It was deliberate, calculated. My eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the heavy curtains, and I lay still, straining to listen. The rustling came from the small kitchen area just a few feet from where I slept. The cabin was remote, miles away from any sign of civilization, surrounded by dense forests that stretched endlessly in every direction. I had come here for solitude, a break from the overwhelming chaos of my life, and for weeks, the isolation had been comforting. But now, every inch of that silence felt like a trap. I finally moved, sliding one foot off the bed onto the cold wooden floor, careful not to make a sound. The noise stopped. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and I froze, holding my breath as I scanned the room. Nothing, no movement, just shadows cast by the faint moonlight seeping through cracks in the curtains. But then I saw it, the front door. It creaked open just slightly, the faintest sliver of moonlight spilling through. A figure, dark and hunched, slipped silently through the gap, clutching something in its arms. I caught the glint of plastic. It had taken some of my food. The door swung shut with a soft click, leaving me paralyzed, staring at the space where the figure had been. I didn't move for what felt like hours. My mind raced with questions. Was it a person, an animal, something else? The remoteness of the cabin made it impossible to believe anyone could have stumbled upon it by accident. And yet, the shape I had seen didn't seem entirely human. The rest of the night passed in tense, sleepless silence. I didn't dare investigate further. Every creak, every shift of the wind outside made me jump. The once comforting isolation of the cabin had turned into a prison. By morning, the fear hadn't subsided. I checked the door, finding no damage, just a few faint scuffs in the dirt outside. There were footprints, but they were indistinct, as though whatever had left them wasn't trying to leave a trail. The cabin itself was small and simple, a single room with a bed, a tiny kitchen, and a wood stove. It had always felt cozy, a safe haven tucked away from the world. Now, it felt exposed, vulnerable. I walked through the space, searching for any signs of forced entry, but found nothing. Whoever, or whatever, Had entered without leaving a trace, save for the missing food. My thoughts flickered between rational explanations and something darker, something I didn't want to consider. The isolation weighed on me. The nearest town was a 2-hour drive, and even then, it was more of a gas station and a handful of houses than a real town. I had chosen this spot precisely because of its remoteness, but now that decision felt like a mistake. I spent the day preparing for the night ahead, reinforcing the door with what little I had. A heavy chair wedged under the knob, a stack of firewood braced against the frame. I found a metal rod in the shed outside and kept it within arm's reach. As the sun began to set, the shadows in the forest deepened, and my unease grew. I didn't want to stay, but leaving wasn't an option. Not yet. My only plan was to make it through the night and reassess in the morning. The second night was worse. I had barely settled into bed when the sound started again. At first it was faint, branches snapping, the occasional crunch of leaves, but then came the soft scraping, like nails dragging lightly against the walls of the cabin. I stayed still, gripping the metal rod tightly. My breathing was shallow, every exhale sounding deafening in the silence. The scraping continued, moving along the walls as if something or someone was circling the cabin. When the sound stopped, I forced myself to move. Slowly, I approached the window, careful not to disturb the curtain as I peered outside. Nothing, just the dark outline of the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. But then I saw it. On the far side of the clearing, just at the edge of the tree line, something moved. A shape barely discernible, but unmistakably there. It didn't step forward, didn't retreat, just stood, watching. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. The rest of the night was a blur of tension, the sounds returning sporadically, but never coming closer. By the time dawn broke, I knew I couldn't stay another night. Morning brought no relief. I packed quickly, throwing essentials into a bag. I left most of my belongings behind. Anything that wasn't necessary was too much to carry. My goal was simple: get away. As I stepped out of the cabin, the forest felt suffocating. The towering trees seemed closer, the undergrowth thicker, as though the entire landscape had shifted overnight. Every step I took felt watched, though I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look back until I reached the edge of the clearing. When I finally turned, my blood ran cold. Through the cabin window, a figure stood, unmoving, its outline dark and indistinct. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I turned back to the trail and began my trek into the forest, each step carrying me farther from the place that had once been my refuge. The forest swallowed me whole. The path leading away from the cabin was barely visible, overgrown with twisting roots and patches of thick underbrush. I moved quickly, my bag slung tightly over my shoulders, but the feeling of being watched never left me. At first, I convinced myself it was paranoia, a natural reaction to the night's events. But as I pushed deeper into the forest, the signs became harder to ignore. Twigs snapped behind me at irregular intervals, and faint rustling sounds seemed to follow my every move. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, curious about my presence. But the footsteps, they were deliberate, matching my pace at times, then stopping when I did. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the dark figure from the cabin, but the forest remained empty. The terrain became more treacherous as I moved farther from the cabin. The ground sloped unevenly, and I found myself stumbling over loose rocks and exposed roots. Each misstep felt like an opportunity for whatever was following me to catch up. By midday, I stumbled upon a shallow creek. I knelt to drink, desperate for a moment of reprieve, but as I splashed water onto my face, I felt it. A presence. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I forced myself to look up, scanning the trees ahead. At first, I saw nothing, but then, between the trunks, a shadow moved, too quickly for me to make out its form, but slow enough to let me know it was there. Panic took over. I grabbed my bag and ran, no longer caring about staying quiet or conserving energy. The forest seemed endless, its oppressive canopy blocking out most of the daylight. I didn't stop running until I stumbled into a small cave nestled at the base of a rocky hill. It wasn't much, but it felt like the closest thing to safety I could find. Exhausted, I crouched inside, clutching my bag like a lifeline. The relief was short-lived. As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, a faint sound reached my ears. Breathing. It was soft, rhythmic, and unmistakably close. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't mine. I bolted from the cave without hesitation, my legs burning with every step. Whatever was in there had been waiting, silent and patient. The fear that had been simmering since the cabin now boiled over, fueling my desperate escape through the dense forest. The daylight was fading, and the trees cast long, jagged shadows across my path. I kept moving, my eyes darting to every dark shape and flickering branch. The presence wasn't just behind me anymore, it was everywhere. I could feel it in the air, in the way the forest seemed to close in around me. Branches clawed at my arms and the underbrush snagged my legs, but I pushed forward. I didn't know where I was going anymore. The sense of direction I'd relied on to reach the cabin was gone, replaced by a singular goal: get out. The forest seemed alive, as if it were working against me. I tripped over roots that hadn't been there a moment before, and low-hanging branches seemed to swipe at my face. But worse than the physical obstacles were the shadows. They moved unnaturally, darting between trees just at the edge of my vision. At one point I stumbled into a clearing. Relief washed over me briefly, thinking I might be close to a road or trail, but the clearing offered no comfort. The trees encircling it were scarred with strange symbols, deep gouges carved into their bark. The patterns were chaotic yet deliberate, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant for me. I didn't linger. The clearing felt wrong, like a trap, and I hurried back into the forest, my chest tightening with every step. The shadows followed, growing bolder as the last light of day faded. As night fell, I stumbled onto a dirt road. Relief surged through me. This was the first sign of civilization I'd seen since leaving the cabin. The road was narrow and unpaved, winding through the forest like a forgotten relic. I started walking, my pace unsteady but determined. The thought of reaching safety gave me a fleeting sense of hope. But as I moved, the oppressive silence returned. There were no distant hums of cars or sounds of wildlife, just the crunch of my boots on the gravel and the faint echo of something behind me. The shadows didn't stay in the forest. They lingered at the edges of the road, slipping between the trees and keeping pace with me. I tried not to look, focusing instead on the horizon, but it was impossible to ignore them. At one point I heard it again, that heavy breathing. It was closer this time, just behind me. My body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. The road stretched on endlessly, its twists and turns revealing nothing but more darkness. The sense of hope I'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a suffocating dread. I wasn't escaping, I was being led. My legs gave out long before I reached the end of the road. I collapsed onto the dirt, my breath ragged and my body trembling with exhaustion. The night was silent again, but it wasn't comforting. I lay there, unable to move, as the presence closed in. I didn't need to see it to know it was there. The weight of its gaze was suffocating, pressing down on me with an almost physical force. For what felt like hours, I didn't move. I couldn't. The world around me blurred into darkness, and I half expected to feel a hand, or something worse, grasp my shoulder. But then, nothing. The weight lifted, and the oppressive silence gave way to the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. When I finally opened my eyes, the road was empty. I didn't stay to question what had happened. Summoning the last of my strength, I got to my feet and kept walking. I didn't look back, not once, until I reached a gas station miles down the road. I never returned to the cabin. I didn't even go back for my belongings. Whatever followed me that night stayed in the forest, but its presence never left my mind. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, a ribbon of asphalt flanked by dense, towering trees. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but an occasional road sign or the glint of an animal's eyes in the underbrush. The stillness was oppressive, the only sounds being the steady hum of my car and the rhythmic thud of tires against uneven pavement. I hadn't seen another car in hours. This part of the country was remote, miles of empty road with no gas stations, houses, or even cell service. I kept driving, eager to reach the next town before fatigue set in. Then, in the distance, I saw something that made me instinctively slow down. A figure stood at the side of the road, their outline sharp against the beams of my headlights. As I got closer, I realized it was a man, his arm raised, thumb pointed out in the universal gesture for a ride. I hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Picking up hitchhikers was something I'd always sworn I'd never do. But as I passed him, I caught a glimpse of his face. He looked calm, clean, and oddly composed for someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. Guilt prickled at the back of my mind. It was a desolate road, after all. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The man approached my car with an easy, measured gait. I rolled down the window slightly. "Need a ride?" I asked, my voice betraying none of the hesitation I felt. "Yes," he replied simply, his tone polite but devoid of any warmth. He slid into the passenger seat, shutting the door with a deliberate gentleness that made me oddly aware of the silence around us. As I eased back onto the road, I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was dressed neatly, dark slacks, a button-down shirt, and a jacket that seemed too formal for the circumstances. His clothes were clean, unwrinkled, and gave no indication of someone who had been walking along a dusty road for long. "Where are you headed?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Wherever you're going is fine," he replied. His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed, and he didn't elaborate. I nodded, unsure how to respond. Most hitchhikers had a story, an urgency, or at least some kind of small talk to offer. But this man seemed content to sit in silence, his gaze fixed ahead. Minutes passed, and the air in the car grew heavy. I could feel his presence acutely, as if he occupied far more space than his lean frame should. When I glanced at him again, I noticed his posture was unnaturally still. He sat with his hands resting neatly in his lap, his back straight, and his head tilted ever so slightly toward me. "You've got a nice car," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Thanks," I replied, my voice tight. His eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than felt comfortable before he turned back to the road. The small talk didn't last. The hitchhiker quickly lapsed into silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt natural. It was heavy, deliberate, as though he were waiting for something. Every so often, he would glance at me, his eyes dark and intense, studying me in a way that made my skin crawl. I tried to focus on the road, but his presence was impossible to ignore. The rhythm of the drive felt off, the usual monotony of the road replaced by a growing unease that gnawed at me with every mile. "Long road," he murmured at one point, almost to himself. "Yeah," I replied quickly, hoping to shut down any further interaction. He didn't respond, but the faint curve of a smile played on his lips, as if he knew something I didn't. The remarks grew stranger as the drive continued. At one point, he commented on the car's mileage, though I hadn't mentioned it. Later, he asked about the nearest town, but followed it up with a statement that seemed oddly personal. "You're not from around here, are you?" I hadn't said anything about where I was from. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the tension in the car became almost unbearable. The hitchhiker's presence had shifted from awkward to oppressive, his cryptic remarks burrowing into my mind. "You're a careful driver," he said after a long silence. Not many people would have stopped. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. The words sounded like a compliment, but the way he said them felt wrong, like he was mocking me for stopping. The road ahead seemed endless, the dense forest on either side closing in like walls. I considered pulling over and asking him to get out, but fear held me back. If this man was truly dangerous, I didn't want to provoke him in the middle of nowhere. Then, as if sensing my unease, he leaned back in his seat and let out a soft chuckle. "You don't have to be so nervous," he said, his tone unnervingly calm. "I'm not going to hurt you." My grip on the wheel tightened. He had said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather. It wasn't reassuring, it was chilling. The only thing that kept me from panicking was the growing hope that the drive would soon end. The tension in the car reached its breaking point when the hitchhiker suddenly leaned forward, his voice low but clear. "You can let me out up ahead," he said, pointing to a faint opening in the dense wall of trees. I squinted into the darkness, barely able to make out what he was indicating. There was no road, no driveway, not even a visible path, just a gap in the foliage that seemed to lead nowhere. "Here?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound composed. He nodded, his calm demeanor unshaken. "This is fine." I slowed the car reluctantly. my gut instinct screaming at me to keep driving. Stopping in such an isolated area felt like the worst possible decision, but the alternative, refusing his request, seemed equally dangerous. The car rolled to a stop, and I glanced at him. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Without another word, he opened the door and stepped out into the darkness. As the hitchhiker stood by the open door, he turned back to me one last time. His eyes met mine, and for a moment I felt as though he could see straight through me. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice calm but carrying an odd weight. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Drive safe." He closed the door with deliberate care, as though he didn't want to disturb the night. I watched as he stepped toward the bushes, his movements unnervingly smooth and unhurried. He didn't hesitate. Without looking back, he disappeared into the thicket, the branches and leaves swallowing him whole. The sound of his footsteps faded quickly, leaving nothing but the hum of my car's engine and the suffocating silence of the forest. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Part of me wanted to drive away immediately, but another part, fueled by morbid curiosity, kept me rooted in place. I stared at the spot where he had vanished, half expecting him to reappear or for something to emerge from the darkness. But nothing happened. Finally, I forced myself to press the gas pedal and drive away. The car surged forward, and the moment I put distance between myself and that spot, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But it was short-lived. As I drove, my mind raced. Who was he? Why had he chosen such an isolated place to be dropped off? And how had he ended up on that road in the first place? None of it made sense. The relief gave way to unease as I noticed something strange. The air in the car felt heavier, almost as if the hitchhiker's presence lingered. I glanced at the passenger seat. It was empty, of course, but the faintest imprint of where he had sat was still visible on the fabric. Then there was the smell. Subtle at first, it grew stronger the farther I drove. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was foreign, like a faint mixture of earth and something metallic. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the road, but my hands trembled as I gripped the wheel. The drive seemed endless, the road stretching on far longer than I remembered. I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see him sitting there, his dark eyes staring back at me. When I finally reached the outskirts of the next town, the oppressive feeling in the car began to lift, though it didn't disappear entirely. I parked in front of a diner, the glow of neon lights a welcome contrast to the darkness I had left behind. The friend request came in the middle of an uneventful evening. I was scrolling aimlessly through my social media feed, a ritual that had become more of a habit than a source of entertainment. The notification popped up suddenly, a request from someone named Evan Markham. The name didn't ring a bell, but the face in the profile picture stopped me. There was something oddly familiar about it. The sharp jawline, the faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, it tickled the edges of recognition, though I couldn't place him. Curiosity won out over caution. I reasoned that it might be an old classmate or someone I'd worked with years ago. Besides, the profile seemed benign enough. A few posts about nature, some scenic photographs, and a handful of mutual friends. I clicked accept. Almost immediately, a notification informed me that Evan was online. His profile sat there in my friend list, a silent presence. It felt strange, though I couldn't articulate why. I brushed it off as overthinking and closed the app, promising myself I'd figure out who he was later. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I had just made a mistake. The first message came the next morning. "Hey, long time no see." It was innocuous enough, the kind of greeting you'd expect from someone reconnecting after years apart. I responded politely, asking how we knew each other. His reply was immediate. "I saw you today." I frowned at the screen, my mind racing. I hadn't left the house all morning. Before I could reply, another message followed. "You haven't changed much." Something about his words made my skin crawl. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had seen me somewhere recently, and I just hadn't noticed him. But how could he know I hadn't changed? His profile offered no clues, just the same scenic photos and a sparse bio. Then, later that evening, he sent me a photo. My breath caught when I opened it. It was of me, taken years ago, standing in front of my childhood home. I didn't remember the photo being taken, and I couldn't fathom how he had it. I didn't respond to the message. I put my phone down and tried to push the incident out of my mind. But the unease lingered, growing stronger with every passing hour. The messages didn't stop. Over the next few days, they became more cryptic, hinting at things he couldn't possibly know. He mentioned places I had been, people I had spoken to, even small details about my home. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe I had shared something online without realizing it. But then there were the things I hadn't shared. The color of my bed sheets, the name of my childhood pet, the exact time I went for a run the previous day. The paranoia began to seep into my daily life. I started noticing small, unsettling details. The blinds in my living room slightly tilted when I was sure I'd left them closed, a book on my desk out of place, the faint smell of cologne in the hallway. The final straw came when he tagged me in a post. It was a photo of a coffee shop I had visited earlier that day, a place I hadn't told anyone about. The caption read, "Nice spot." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. Someone was watching me. I decided to confront the situation head on. I went back to his profile, determined to figure out who he was. But the more I looked, the less sense it made. His profile was a shell. No posts older than a month, no comments from friends, no activity beyond his interactions with me. Even the mutual friends we shared seemed random, like they had accepted his request without a second thought. I tried to block him, but every time I clicked the option, an error message popped up. Reporting his account resulted in the same error. It was as if his profile was untouchable, immune to the normal functions of the platform. That night, I received a final message: "You can't hide." It was then that I decided I'd had enough. I deleted the app from my phone and resolved not to reinstall it. But as I lay in bed, staring at the darkened ceiling, I knew it wasn't over. Whoever, or whatever, was behind that account wasn't just online. The faint sound of footsteps outside my bedroom window confirmed it. When I woke the next morning, I checked my phone instinctively, half expecting to see another notification. But when I reopened the app, Evan Markham was gone. His profile had vanished entirely. No messages, no tags, no trace of his existence. At first, I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe he had deleted the account, or perhaps the platform had finally acted on my failed report. But that relief was fleeting. Something about the abrupt disappearance felt too calculated, too perfectly timed. I tried to move on with my day, convincing myself that I was safe now. But as I went about my routine, subtle signs began to emerge, signs that I wasn't as alone as I thought. In the bathroom, I noticed my toothbrush had been moved. In the living room, a framed photo on the shelf was slightly crooked. These were small details, insignificant enough that I might have overlooked them under normal circumstances. But now, each one felt like a message, a reminder that someone, or something, had been here. By mid-afternoon, the unease had grown unbearable. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every window felt like a set of eyes, every creak in the house like a footstep. Then I found the envelope. It was sitting on my doorstep, plain and unmarked, as though it had been placed there with deliberate care. My hands trembled as I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single photograph, old and slightly faded. It was of me, sitting in a park I used to visit as a teenager. The angle of the shot was unsettling, as if taken from a hiding place. In the background, barely visible among the trees, was a dark silhouette watching me. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Every sound in the house sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The creaking floorboards, the groan of the pipes, the faint rustle of wind against the windows, they all felt deliberate, as though someone was testing the boundaries of my sanity. Around midnight, I heard it, a knock at the front door. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it cut through the silence like a knife. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might echo through the room. The knock came again, louder this time. I didn't move. I didn't dare approach the door. Instead, I crept to the window, keeping low to the ground as I peeked outside. The porch was empty. I stayed there for hours, watching, waiting, but nothing happened. By the time the sun began to rise, I convinced myself that it was over. But when I went to the door later that morning, I found another note slipped underneath it. In neat block letters it read, "I'm closer than you think." Desperation drove me to take action. I purchased a set of security cameras and spent the day installing them around the house. I positioned them carefully, ensuring every entry point was covered. If whoever was tormenting me came back, I would have proof. That night, I sat in front of the camera feed, watching the screens intently. The hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. The stillness outside was oppressive, the quiet amplifying every minor sound within the house. Around 3 a.m., the motion detector on one of the cameras activated. My breath caught as I focused on the screen. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark outline of my backyard. But then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, standing motionless in the center of the yard. His face was obscured by darkness, but his posture was unmistakably deliberate. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring directly at the bedroom window where I was watching. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he turned and melted back into the darkness. When I reviewed the footage later, my stomach dropped. The cameras had captured nothing. I woke the next morning to a house eerily silent. The cameras were offline, the screens blank. I checked the front door and found it slightly ajar, though I had locked it the night before. I stepped outside cautiously, the cold morning air biting at my skin. The world was quiet, almost unnaturally so. My eyes scanned the ground, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. They led away from my house, winding down the street before disappearing into the distance. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led or who they belonged to. Instead, I went back inside and began deleting every social media account I had. One by one, I erased my online presence, hoping it would be enough to sever the connection. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Even now, days later, I can feel it. The weight of unseen eyes, the sense that I'm never truly alone. Evan Markham may be gone, but whoever or whatever he was, he left something behind. The bus station was alive with chaos. A relentless tide of people surged through the building, each with their own purpose, their own destination. I was one of them, dragging my suitcase behind me, my mind scattered with the details of my day. My train of thought was broken only by the mechanical announcements echoing from the loudspeakers and the ceaseless shuffle of feet across the tiled floor. My train was arriving in 10 minutes, and I hadn't even checked the platform yet. Jostled by the crowd, I found myself shuffling closer to the carousel where suitcases were lined up in disorganized rows. A flash of familiar black caught my eye, a suitcase, identical to mine, right down to the scuffed corner and faded travel tag. Without much thought, I grabbed the handle and began to push my way back through the throng of travelers. The weight of the suitcase surprised me. It felt heavier than I remembered. I shook it off as fatigue. It had been a long day. Weaving through the station's labyrinth of corridors, I finally found a quiet spot to rest. The suitcase leaned heavily against my leg, its presence oddly oppressive. I felt no satisfaction in securing it, only a vague sense that something was off. But there wasn't time to dwell on it. My bus was boarding, and I hurried off without a second thought. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the first real sign of trouble. The suitcase felt foreign as I set it down in the hallway, the handle stiff under my grip. A small voice in the back of my mind urged caution, but I dismissed it as overthinking. I unzipped the case quickly, eager to unpack and put the day behind me. What I found stopped me cold. Inside was a neatly folded shirt, but its crisp white fabric was marred by deep red stains. Beneath it, a pair of leather gloves lay next to a small collection of tools, blunt, metal objects that didn't belong in a travel bag. My hands trembled as I lifted a sealed envelope from the side pocket, feeling the unmistakable bulk of cash inside. My breath hitched as I counted the stacks in my mind, even though I never opened the envelope. The full weight of the mistake hit me. This suitcase wasn't mine. This suitcase belonged to someone else, someone I didn't want to know. Panic swelled, but I pushed it aside. I closed the suitcase, sealing away its secrets, and paced the room. The police. I needed to call the police. But what would I say? That I had accidentally taken it? That it was full of evidence of a crime? The night crept on, but the suitcase sat in my living room, its presence growing heavier by the hour. Sleep was out of the question. My thoughts circled endlessly around the same questions. How had I made such a careless mistake? What would happen if the real owner came looking for it? By morning, I had made my decision. I would take it to the police. Explaining everything might be humiliating, but it was better than having this thing in my house any longer. I wrapped the suitcase in an old blanket to keep it inconspicuous and left my apartment, my steps heavier than usual. The city seemed quieter than normal as I walked to the station. I kept my head down, but paranoia made me glance over my shoulder at regular intervals. The street was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It was halfway to the station when I noticed them. A pair of men walking too close for comfort, their pace matching mine at every turn. At first, I thought it was coincidence. The city streets were busy enough, and I could have been imagining things. But when I crossed to the other side of the street, they followed. When I ducked into a side alley, they appeared moments later, their movements deliberate. My heart pounded as I quickened my steps. I clutched the suitcase tighter, its weight a reminder of the trouble I had unwittingly invited into my life. Turning a corner sharply, I hoped to lose them in the warren of streets I knew well. But they stayed close, their silent pursuit more unnerving than any threat could have been. By the time I reached the edge of an unfamiliar block, I knew I had to act. My instincts screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The men were closing in. My breath was shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears as I scanned my surroundings for an escape route. I turned a corner and found myself staring at a blank wall, a dead end. My stomach dropped as I realized there was no way out. The narrow alleyway was enclosed on 3 sides, its brick walls tall and unyielding. I glanced behind me, desperate, but the men were already there, blocking my retreat. They were closer now, close enough that I could see their faces, though they betrayed nothing but quiet determination. Neither of them spoke, but their presence carried a weight that felt suffocating. My eyes darted to the suitcase in my hand, and I gripped it tighter, unsure if I was protecting it or myself. One of them stepped forward. He didn't raise his hand or make any sudden moves. He simply stopped a few feet away and stared at me. His gaze wasn't hostile, but it wasn't kind either. It was a command without words. Hand it over. I hesitated, my mind racing. Was there any point in resisting? They didn't look like they were here to negotiate, and the alley offered no help. My palms were slick as I loosened my grip on the handle, the suitcase's weight feeling unbearable now. Slowly, I extended my arm, offering it to the man. He took it without a sound, his movements deliberate and methodical. The other man stepped forward then, giving me one last glance, as if assessing whether I was any threat. Apparently satisfied, he turned and followed his companion. Together, they walked back the way they had come, leaving me frozen in place. They didn't look back. For a long moment, I didn't move. My breath came in shallow bursts as I stared at the empty space where they had stood. The suitcase was gone, but its absence didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. My knees buckled slightly as the adrenaline ebbed, and I leaned against the cold wall for support. The street beyond the alley was eerily quiet now, as if the world had reset itself in their absence. I waited, half expecting them to return, or for something else to happen, but nothing did. It was just me, the walls, and the faint hum of distant traffic. Eventually, I forced myself to leave. My legs felt unsteady as I made my way back to the main road, each step weighed down by an invisible pressure. I glanced behind me repeatedly, but the men were nowhere to be seen. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching, even from a distance. I didn't go to the police station. Somehow, it felt pointless now. What could I even report? The suitcase was gone, and with it, any evidence of what had happened. All I wanted was to get home and put as much distance as I could between myself and the events of the day. The next few days were a blur. At first, I stayed inside, my curtains drawn, jumping at every unexpected sound. Paranoia took root, and I found myself checking the locks on my doors and windows repeatedly. The memory of the men's silent presence haunted me, replaying in my mind like a broken record. When I finally ventured out, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Cars I didn't recognize lingered near my building, and strangers on the street seemed to pay me too much attention. But whenever I turned to confront them, they were gone, or their faces revealed nothing unusual. The world around me had become alien, filled with shadows and whispers. Even mundane errands felt like a risk, and I began to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. The suitcase had been a mistake, a simple error, but its consequences lingered like a stain I couldn't erase. Time passed and the men didn't return, but their absence didn't bring peace. Instead, it left an emptiness, a question that would never be answered. Who were they? What had I stumbled into? The thought of the suitcase, the bloodied clothes, the cash refused to leave my mind. I tried to return to my normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the streets for familiar faces or unusual cars. At night, I slept fitfully, jolted awake by phantom noises and imagined threats. Eventually, I stopped looking for answers. The truth, whatever it was, felt too dangerous to uncover. I buried the memory as best I could, though it never fully faded. It became a part of me, a shadow that lingered on the edge of my thoughts. Life went on, as it always does, but I knew I would never be the same. The world had shown me a glimpse of something dark and unknowable, and I had barely escaped. And yet, in the quiet moments, I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly escaped at all?